What if I told you that in the heart of Africa, a single inventor claims to be orchestrating $6 billion mega projects powerful enough to reshape an entire continent's technological destiny? Not decades from now, not in theory, but right now. From energy systems that promise fuel-free power to futuristic vehicles, aerospace ambitions, smart infrastructure, and industrial manufacturing ecosystems, the name at the center of it all is Maxwell Chikumbutso. To some, he is a misunderstood genius. To others, a controversial disruptor challenging global scientific norms. But one thing is undeniable: his ambitions are enormous. And if even part of his vision materializes at scale, Africa's economic trajectory could shift dramatically. Let's step inside the six giant billion-dollar projects that are being positioned as catalysts for Africa's rise. It begins with energy, because without power, nothing else moves. Chikumbutso's most talked-about development revolves around self-sustaining power systems. Unlike traditional solar or fossil fuel plants, these systems are presented as autonomous energy generators designed to operate independently of conventional grids. The promise? Electricity without recurring fuel dependency. In regions across Africa where grid reliability remains inconsistent, the implications would be profound. Imagine industrial parks operating 24/7 without diesel generators. Hospitals free from blackout interruptions. Rural communities bypassing decades of infrastructure delays. Energy independence is not just a technical upgrade, it's economic liberation. And that leads directly to project number 2, smart industrial manufacturing hubs. Rather than exporting raw materials and importing finished goods, a pattern that has limited value creation across many African economies, the vision here is vertical integration. Locally powered factories. Locally assembled electronics. Locally engineered transport systems. Industrial self-sufficiency doesn't just create jobs. It compounds wealth internally. Then comes transportation, one of the most visible components of his ambition. Chikumbutso has unveiled electric vehicle prototypes and alternative mobility systems aimed at reducing Africa's dependence on imported automotive technology. If scaled successfully, localized EV production could lower costs, stimulate supply chains, and create technical skill ecosystems across borders. And in a continent where urbanization is accelerating faster than infrastructure expansion, mobility innovation isn't optional, it's urgent. But he doesn't stop on the ground. Project 4 reaches for the skies. Aerospace concepts, including helicopters and advanced propulsion systems, have been introduced as part of a long-term defense and aviation strategy. Whether civilian, commercial, or security-focused, the symbolism is powerful. Africa not just consuming aerospace technology, but designing it. Historically, aerospace capability has been a marker of advanced industrial maturity. It represents engineering depth, materials science sophistication, and national confidence. Now consider what that signals to global markets if even partial production capacity becomes reality. Then comes digital integration. Smart cities powered by autonomous energy. Industrial zones monitored by AI-driven systems. Infrastructure linked through advanced communication networks. When energy, manufacturing, mobility, and data ecosystems converge, you don't just get development. You get exponential acceleration. And that's where the billion-dollar scale begins to make sense. Each project individually is ambitious. Combined, they represent a vertically integrated technological ecosystem. Energy powers factories. Factories build vehicles. Vehicles enable logistics. Logistics support urban expansion. Urban expansion feeds digital economies. It's a feedback loop designed for continental growth. But here's where the narrative becomes even more compelling. Africa's demographic profile is one of the youngest in the world. A rapidly expanding workforce, increasing digital adoption, and rising entrepreneurial ecosystems create fertile ground for large-scale transformation. If homegrown innovation can align with capital, governance, and infrastructure frameworks, the multiplier effect could be historic. Of course, bold claims invite scrutiny. Global scientific communities often demand transparent peer review, reproducible validation, and third-party verification before accepting breakthrough energy systems. Investors require data. Governments require compliance. Markets require trust. And this is where the story transitions from ambition to execution. Because billion-dollar visions don't reshape continents on narrative alone. They require scaling capacity, supply chain reliability, regulatory navigation, capital discipline, international partnerships. Yet the symbolism of the projects themselves carries weight beyond immediate commercialization. They challenge a long-standing psychological ceiling, the idea that Africa must import its future rather than engineer it. And psychological transformation often precedes economic transformation. When young engineers see prototypes being built locally, aspiration shifts. When entrepreneurs witness billion-dollar targets set domestically, ambition expands. When governments see technological sovereignty as achievable, policy priorities evolve. Momentum builds quietly at first, then gradually, then all at once. And this is where the sixth giant project enters the equation: large-scale infrastructure integration. Energy generation linked directly to housing developments. Industrial production tied to transportation corridors. Strategic economic zones built around autonomous utilities. Instead of isolated projects, the aim appears to be ecosystem clustering, where every development feeds the next. This clustering effect is what transforms projects into movements. A power system installed in one region becomes proof of concept. A manufacturing hub attracts supply chain partners. A transport prototype attracts municipal contracts. A housing project integrates all three. Capital begins to follow credibility. And credibility compounds faster than marketing ever could. The broader implication is continental leverage. When nations control core technologies, energy, transport, manufacturing, they negotiate differently in global markets. Trade dynamics shift. Debt dependency decreases. Intellectual property ownership expands. Africa transitions from resource supplier to technology stakeholder. Now imagine $6 billion projects moving in parallel. Even if scaled incrementally, even if partially realized, the structural ripple effects would extend across energy markets, employment rates, foreign direct investment flows, and regional integration strategies. And as global supply chains diversify in response to geopolitical shifts, new industrial players have an opportunity to emerge. Timing matters. Demographics matter. Narrative matters. Execution matters most. Because if these projects evolve from prototypes to production lines, from concepts to certified systems, from local installations to cross-border expansion, then the story won't just be about one inventor. It will be about a continent recalibrating its economic trajectory. And what makes this moment particularly intriguing is not just the scale of ambition, but the convergence of need and possibility. Energy deficits create urgency. Youth unemployment creates pressure. Import dependency creates vulnerability. Technological ambition creates direction. When those forces collide, transformation accelerates. Yet beneath the headlines and billion-dollar projections lies a deeper question. Can Africa leapfrog traditional development stages? Instead of replicating Western industrial pathways, can it integrate decentralized energy, localized manufacturing, and smart infrastructure simultaneously, compressing decades into years? If so, these 6 giant projects may represent early experiments in that compression model. Because true power isn't just about megawatts or machinery. It's about ownership. Ownership of systems. Ownership of innovation. Ownership of destiny. And as prototypes evolve and partnerships form behind the scenes, conversations are already shifting in policy circles, investment boards, and youth innovation hubs across the continent. The next phase won't be defined by announcements. It will be defined by deployment, installations, contracts, scaling milestones, independent validation, regional adoption. And as that phase unfolds, the ripple effects could move faster than many anticipate. Because once energy stabilizes, productivity spikes. Friction from legacy systems that benefit from import dependency. Friction from entrenched supply chains. Friction from regulatory frameworks built for old energy models. Friction from skepticism rooted in past disappointments. And friction is not failure. It's pressure. Pressure that tests whether a vision is durable or just aspirational. For these 6 giant projects to truly power Africa's rise, they must transition from visionary prototypes into audited performance data. That means measurable output, verified efficiency, transparent engineering documentation, independent certification. Because at the billion-dollar level, inspiration alone doesn't unlock capital. Evidence does. And if validated, the leverage multiplies. Consider what verified autonomous energy generation would mean for emerging industrial corridors across southern and West Africa. Instead of waiting for centralized grid expansion, special economic zones could operate on self-contained systems. Manufacturing timelines would shorten. Investor confidence would rise. Insurance risk profiles would shift. Energy stability is economic stability. Now layer in localized vehicle manufacturing. If transport systems are designed and assembled domestically, supply chain value remains inside the continent. Skilled labor markets expand. Technical education institutions align curriculum with real industry demand. Research and development ecosystems form organically around production hubs. And once R&D ecosystems take root, innovation accelerates exponentially. But here's the deeper layer most people overlook. These 6 projects aren't just infrastructure plays, they're narrative plays. For decades, global investment narratives about Africa have centered on extraction, minerals, oil, agriculture. The value chain largely ended at export terminals. A pivot toward high-value engineering flips that narrative. From extraction to production. From consumption to creation. From dependency to participation. And narratives influence capital flows more than most people realize. When global markets begin viewing a region as a technology originator rather than merely a consumer base, funding structures change. Venture capital shifts. Strategic partnerships deepen. Multinational collaboration expands beyond resource contracts into joint innovation. The psychological barrier breaks. But that barrier only breaks with consistency. Deployment after deployment. Facility after facility. Installation after installation. Momentum must become visible. And visible momentum attracts geopolitical attention. Energy independence alters diplomatic negotiations. Manufacturing capacity reshapes trade agreements. Aerospace development signals strategic capability. Smart infrastructure integration elevates national bargaining power. Technology becomes policy leverage. Yet with greater leverage comes greater scrutiny. International scientific communities will demand peer-reviewed validation of energy claims. Financial institutions will require audited financial models. Governments will request compliance certifications. Media will investigate timelines and feasibility. And that scrutiny, if navigated correctly, can become an asset rather than a threat. Because transparent verification transforms bold claims into credible breakthroughs. If even 2 or 3 of these $6 billion projects reach scalable maturity, the compound effect could redefine industrial ambition across the continent. Young engineers in Harare, developers in Lagos, manufacturers in Nairobi, investors in Johannesburg. They begin asking different questions. Not, can we import this? But can we build this? And that shift, subtle at first, spreads quickly in an interconnected digital era. Innovation hubs replicate models. Universities partner with private labs. Governments design policy incentives around domestic production. Regional blocs explore shared infrastructure strategies. Africa's rise becomes less about catching up and more about carving a differentiated path. A path built around decentralized energy. Localized production, integrated smart systems, continental collaboration. But the clock is ticking. Global competition for technological dominance is intensifying. Supply chains are reconfiguring. Climate policy is accelerating renewable transitions. Artificial intelligence is reshaping labor markets. Timing will determine whether these projects position Africa ahead of the curve or reacting to it. And this is where leadership becomes critical. Vision alone cannot orchestrate $6 billion ecosystems. It requires management discipline, cross-border diplomacy, engineering rigor, and financial architecture capable of sustaining long development cycles. Scaling hardware is fundamentally different from unveiling prototypes. Factories demand logistics. Energy systems demand maintenance frameworks. Aerospace systems demand certification pathways. Smart cities demand cybersecurity resilience. Every layer introduces complexity, but complexity, when mastered, becomes competitive advantage. Because few regions have the opportunity to design next-generation infrastructure without being locked into outdated legacy systems. In many ways, Africa's infrastructure gaps create freedom to leap directly into advanced models without the burden of retrofitting century-old grids or transport networks. That freedom could become its greatest asset. If these 6 projects align correctly, they form not just isolated developments, but an industrial flywheel. Energy fuels factories. Factories produce transport. Transport expands markets. Markets generate revenue. Revenue funds R&D. R&D improves energy. A self-reinforcing loop. And loops are powerful. Once momentum crosses a threshold, acceleration becomes self-sustaining. But thresholds require critical mass. Critical mass of installations. Critical mass of talent. Critical mass of capital. Critical mass of public trust. Trust may be the most important variable of all, because transformative technology must earn belief through performance. In an age of viral headlines and exaggerated claims, consistency becomes currency. Deliver once. Deliver twice. Deliver repeatedly. And skepticism gradually converts into credibility. If that conversion happens, these 6 giant billion-dollar projects may mark the beginning of a new industrial chapter, not just for one nation, but for an interconnected continent. A chapter where Africa is not merely adapting to global technological change, but shaping it. And as partnerships quietly form behind closed doors, as prototypes evolve into production units, as negotiations unfold across ministries and private investors, the real story may not be the announcements we see. It may be the infrastructure being installed quietly, system by system, contract by contract. Because revolutions rarely arrive fully formed. They build incrementally, strategically, relentlessly. Because tipping points don't announce themselves. They reveal themselves through patterns. A factory that quietly doubles output. An energy installation that runs continuously without interruption. A municipal contract that renews for 10 years instead of 1. A foreign investor that shifts from observation to participation. And suddenly, what was once questioned becomes studied. What was once doubted becomes benchmarked. What was once local becomes continental. If these 6 giant billion-dollar projects reach that inflection stage, the impact won't just be economic, it will be structural. Think about the ripple effect across education systems. Technical universities aligning programs with real industrial demand. Engineering graduates stepping into advanced manufacturing rather than emigrating. Research labs receiving private sector funding tied directly to production needs. Brain drain slows. Brain circulation begins. Now imagine regional integration accelerating as neighboring countries seek participation in the ecosystem. Energy exports through decentralized systems. Cross-border supply chains feeding manufacturing hubs. Shared aerospace research facilities. Joint smart infrastructure initiatives. Economic blocs gain tangible infrastructure anchors instead of abstract policy agreements. And with tangible assets comes negotiating strength. When nations can point to operational energy independence, localized production lines, and certified aerospace capabilities, they negotiate trade, debt, and technology transfer from a different posture. Confidence replaces concession. But the real power may lie in the psychological domino effect. Young entrepreneurs no longer see billion-dollar ambition as foreign territory. They see it as achievable within their own geography. Startups begin aiming higher. Investors begin writing larger checks. Governments begin designing policy for scale rather than subsistence. Ambition compounds. Yet none of this unfolds without sustained operational discipline. Supply chains must stabilize under pressure. Quality control must meet international standards. After-sales service networks must function reliably. Data security must withstand global scrutiny. Because at scale, even small inefficiencies multiply rapidly. And this is where many visionary projects stall, not at the idea stage, but at the operational stage. Execution is the ultimate filter. If Maxwell Chikumbutso's ecosystem navigates that filter successfully, the transformation becomes measurable in metrics, not headlines. Energy uptime percentages, manufacturing output volumes, export diversification ratios, employment multipliers, technology patent registrations. Numbers tell stories that narratives cannot. And once numbers validate momentum, capital flows more freely. Private equity enters earlier. Development banks reduce risk premiums. Strategic global partners negotiate joint ventures instead of purchase agreements. Africa shifts from being a market to being a collaborator. But here's where the dynamic becomes even more intriguing. The convergence of decentralized energy, local manufacturing, aerospace ambition, and smart infrastructure creates a foundation for something larger: technological sovereignty. Sovereignty doesn't mean isolation. It means optionality. The ability to choose partnerships rather than depend on them. The ability to negotiate from strength rather than necessity. The ability to innovate internally without waiting for external validation. And in a world where supply chain disruptions, geopolitical tensions, and energy volatility are becoming more frequent, optionality is power. Now imagine a scenario 5 to 10 years forward. Multiple energy installations operational across several regions. Manufacturing hubs exporting regionally. Transport systems integrated into urban planning strategies. Aerospace divisions collaborating with continental partners. Smart infrastructure feeding real-time data into economic planning. At that stage, the narrative no longer revolves around a single inventor. It revolves around an industrial movement. And movements attract participation. Engineers relocate to opportunity zones. Investors allocate long-term capital. Policymakers design multi-decade frameworks. Youth build careers aligned with domestic innovation cycles. Momentum becomes cultural. Culture becomes identity. And identity drives sustainability. But it's important to recognize that transformation at this scale is rarely linear. There will be delays. There will be regulatory hurdles. There will be funding negotiations that stall. There will be critics who amplify uncertainty. The defining factor will not be the absence of obstacles, but the resilience through them. Because resilience signals seriousness, and seriousness commands respect in global markets. If these 6 projects persist through validation cycles, operational scaling, and independent oversight, they could create a blueprint for emerging economies worldwide, a model where decentralized energy and localized manufacturing form the backbone of rapid industrialization. That blueprint could be replicated, refined, expanded, and once replicated, the story transcends geography. It becomes proof that technological leapfrogging is possible when ambition aligns with infrastructure strategy. But we're still in the unfolding phase. Installations are being tested. Partnerships are being negotiated. Systems are being refined. Markets are watching. And as the watching turns into engagement, and engagement turns into collaboration, and collaboration turns into measurable output, the rise accelerates. Not as a sudden explosion, but as a sustained ascent. And somewhere between prototype and production, between skepticism and proof, between ambition and validation, a new industrial rhythm begins to take shape. Quietly.
Strategically. System by system.
Project by project. Billion by billion. The global economy is shifting in real time. Energy transitions are accelerating. Artificial intelligence is automating industries. Climate mandates are rewriting infrastructure priorities. Supply chains are diversifying at historic speed. In that environment, hesitation becomes expensive. So the real variable isn't just ambition, it's velocity. How quickly can installation scale? How rapidly can manufacturing standardize? How efficiently can certification be secured? How strategically can partnerships expand beyond borders? Velocity determines influence. And influence determines whether these $6 billion projects remain national experiments or evolve into continental anchors. If deployment accelerates, secondary industries begin forming around the core ecosystem. Component suppliers emerge. Maintenance firms expand. Software developers build monitoring systems. Training institutions specialize in operational support. An industrial web starts to form, interconnected, interdependent, self-reinforcing. And once that web reaches density, disruption becomes difficult. Because it's no longer one project. It's thousands of livelihoods. It's institutional alignment. It's infrastructure dependency. That's when permanence begins. But permanence demands proof of durability. Energy systems must operate across seasons and climates. Vehicles must endure real-world stress conditions. Aerospace platforms must pass rigorous testing cycles. Smart infrastructure must resist cyber vulnerabilities. Durability converts innovation into infrastructure. And infrastructure shapes destiny. If these 6 giant projects cross that durability threshold, Africa's rise won't be framed as potential anymore. It will be framed as precedent. A precedent that large-scale technological ecosystems can originate internally. A precedent that billion-dollar ambition can be domestically engineered. A precedent that dependency can gradually be replaced with capability. And precedents reshape expectations. Global markets begin factoring African innovation into long-term forecasts. Strategic alliances begin including African manufacturers as core contributors. Technology roadmaps begin integrating continental production capacity. Visibility expands. But with visibility comes responsibility. Scaling too fast risks overextension. Scaling too slow risks irrelevance. Capital misallocation risks instability. Lack of transparency risks credibility erosion. Balance becomes everything. Operational discipline must match visionary scale. Because billion-dollar ecosystems collapse not from lack of ambition, but from lack of governance structure. If governance aligns with growth, the transformation compounds sustainably. And as sustainability takes hold, something even more powerful begins to emerge: confidence. Confidence among engineers that their work has continental impact. Confidence among investors that returns are grounded in production. Confidence among governments that domestic innovation can anchor policy. Confidence is contagious. It spreads through industries. It spreads through borders. It spreads through generations. And generational shifts are where true transformation lives. A teenager watching a locally engineered transport system roll out doesn't see limitation. They see blueprint. A university student studying energy systems doesn't see dependency. They see opportunity. An entrepreneur analyzing manufacturing data doesn't see import necessity. They see export potential. Perception changes trajectory. And trajectory, sustained over time, changes history. If these 6 projects maintain momentum, they could ignite something larger than infrastructure, a continental recalibration of what is considered achievable. No longer incremental development, but structural advancement. No longer reactive modernization, but proactive innovation. And as capital markets, policymakers, and global institutions observe the unfolding progress, a subtle shift may begin taking place behind closed doors. Risk assessments recalibrated. Investment portfolios diversified. Partnership frameworks redesigned. Africa moves from peripheral consideration to strategic inclusion. And strategic inclusion alters long-term economic gravity. Trade routes adapt. Industrial clusters form. Technology exchanges intensify. But gravity is built through mass. Massive output. Mass of credibility. Mass of sustained delivery. The next chapter of this story will not be written by announcements. It will be written by performance metrics accumulating quarter after quarter. Megawatts delivered. Units manufactured. Contracts fulfilled. Systems certified. Quiet numbers. Powerful consequences. And as those numbers stack, the 6 giant billion-dollar projects may begin to merge in the public consciousness, no longer seen as isolated ambitions, but as a unified architecture of ascent. An architecture built on energy autonomy, industrial localization, mobility innovation, aerospace ambition, digital integration, Infrastructure convergence. Each pillar reinforcing the others. Each milestone strengthening the flywheel. And when flywheels gain enough rotational force, stopping them becomes nearly impossible. The world has witnessed such moments before, regions once underestimated rising into industrial prominence within a generation. The difference now is speed. Information moves instantly. Capital reallocates rapidly. Technology iterates continuously, which means if momentum solidifies, acceleration could exceed historical precedents. But we remain in the unfolding phase. Installations expanding, facilities scaling, teams growing, validation processes advancing. Every day adds data. Every quarter adds evidence. And evidence is the bridge between ambition and inevitability. If that bridge strengthens with time, the question shifts again. Not will it happen, but how far will it go? Will these projects anchor regional manufacturing corridors? Will they influence continental policy frameworks? Will they inspire parallel billion-dollar ecosystems across neighboring nations? Because innovation, once proven, rarely stays isolated. It spreads, adapted, improved, replicated. And replication is the ultimate sign of impact. So, as Africa stands at the intersection of demographic power, technological acceleration, and industrial aspiration, these 6 giant projects sit at a pivotal junction. Between skepticism and validation. Between ambition and execution. Between possibility and permanence. The rise is not a headline. It is a process. A layered, strategic, disciplined process. And as that process continues unfolding, system by system, installation by installation, contract by contract, momentum inches closer to that irreversible threshold. The threshold where ambition transforms into architecture, where architecture transforms into influence,